The fundamental essence of human justice has perpetually rested on the balance of outcomes, a reality that becomes intensely visible when absolute catastrophe strips away the comfortable illusions of civilization. When we look at the choices people make under extreme duress, the moral weight of an action is frequently judged not by the cleanliness of the method, but by the tangible state of the world left in its wake. Imagine navigating a massive, unstoppable vessel down a fixed path where destruction is mathematically guaranteed in one direction, leaving you with only a split-second window to alter the trajectory toward a lesser tragedy. In these moments, the mind instinctively abandons abstract, unyielding rules about sacred duties and shifts toward a calculation of raw survival and minimized loss. Saving 5 lives at the direct expense of a single life presents a stark, undeniable arithmetic that forces us to realize how deeply our sense of right and wrong is tied to numbers. It is an uncomfortable truth that when life is reduced to its barest elements, the preservation of the majority becomes an almost undeniable mandate, overriding the quiet background instinct that every individual possesses an unassailable right to remain completely untouched by the tragedies of others. This exact mathematical logic underpins the way modern societies evaluate historical events of immense scale, where the sacrifice of a few is routinely framed as a heroic necessity to protect the many. We see this play out vividly in the collective remembrance of national tragedies, where individuals who intentionally steered a compromised aircraft into an empty field are universally celebrated as national heroes. The mathematical equation in that devastating scenario remains identical to the runaway vessel, as the deliberate termination of a small group of passengers directly prevented the catastrophic obliteration of thousands of innocent citizens inside highly populated urban structures. Society does not look at those brave individuals and condemn them for actively choosing a path that resulted in immediate death. Instead, we recognize that under the crushing weight of a tragic circumstance, the only rational baseline for morality is the preservation of the highest possible number of human souls. This realization forces us to accept that under extreme conditions, the moral quality of our choices is defined entirely by the ultimate consequences they produce. The sheer volume of preserved life legitimizes the active choice to redirect harm, transforming what would normally be viewed as a horrific act into a profound expression of collective preservation. However, the moment we attempt to stretch this mathematical framework across every scenario of human suffering, we run into a profound wall of psychological resistance that challenges the consistency of our moral logic. Consider how the exact same calculation, sacrificing one to save 5, completely mutates in our minds when the physical context shifts from steering a moving vehicle to physically manipulating another human being who is completely external to the danger. If you are standing on an elevated walkway, merely observing the impending doom of 5 individuals below, and you realize that pushing a single heavy bystander into the path of destruction would halt the catastrophe, the mathematical balance remains entirely unchanged. Yet the overwhelming majority of people experience an intense, visceral rejection of this action, feeling a deep internal boundary that forbids the physical pushing of an innocent person to their demise. This stark contradiction reveals a massive split in human psychology, demonstrating that while we eagerly embrace the minimization of death when it feels like redirecting an already existing crisis, we suddenly shrink back when the preservation of the majority requires us to initiate a brand new act of physical aggression against someone who was completely safe. This deep conflict in our moral reasoning stems from a powerful non-negotiable intuition that certain actions possess an intrinsic wrongness that no amount of positive consequences can ever justify. When people recoil from the idea of physically pushing a bystander or opening a trapdoor beneath their feet, they are pointing toward a completely different philosophical framework, one that views human beings not as mere numbers to be added or subtracted, but as holders of absolute rights. This perspective argues that it is fundamentally, categorically wrong to weaponize an innocent person's body without their explicit consent, regardless of how many lives that sacrifice might ultimately salvage. The internal panic people experience when trying to explain why turning a vehicle is acceptable, but pushing a person is monstrous, highlights the fragile nature of our ethical consistency. We desperately want to believe that our moral codes are built on clean, universal laws, yet we constantly find ourselves sliding between a calculation of numbers and an adherence to sacred boundaries depending entirely on how close our hands are to the actual mechanism of death. To fully expose the absolute limit of this numbers game, we must look at how these competing principles clash within the walls of a modern medical facility, where the stakes of life and death are managed daily. Imagine a scenario where a crisis physician is faced with 6 individuals who have survived a massive transportation accident, with 5 suffering from moderate injuries and 1 in critical, near-fatal condition. If the physician dedicates the entirety of their time and resources to saving the single critically injured person, the other 5 will inevitably succumb to their wounds, whereas treating the five means letting the one pass away. In this specific context, almost every rational person agrees that the physician must prioritize the five, reinforcing the idea that maximizing the number of survivors is the only defensible path forward. The choice feels clean because the physician is simply managing a tragedy that arrived at their doorstep, distributing limited medical attention in a way that yields the highest statistical survival rate. The math works seamlessly here because all parties are already deeply embedded in the exact same medical emergency, allowing the principle of utility to operate without violating our deeper sense of natural justice. But if we alter the medical scenario just slightly, the very same calculation turns into something so terrifying that it threatens the entire moral foundation of human society. Imagine a transplant specialist who has five patients rapidly declining from total organ failure, each desperately requiring a different vital organ to survive, with absolutely no donors available on the medical horizon. In the adjacent room sits a completely healthy individual who merely walked into the clinic for a routine physical checkup and has fallen asleep. The raw mathematical equation dictates that by quietly ending the life of this single healthy individual and distributing their organs, five distinct human lives can be completely restored to health, resulting in a net gain of four lives. Yet the mere suggestion of this action triggers universal horror and absolute condemnation, illustrating that society cannot function if individuals can be actively hunted and dismantled for the biological benefit of the collective. This total rejection proves that we do not truly believe numbers are the final authority in human ethics, and that an individual's right to physical security must stand as an absolute barrier against the mathematical desires of the majority. When we take a step back from these intense scenarios, we begin to see that human civilization is caught in a perpetual civil war between two radically distinct modes of moral thinking. The first mode asserts that the ethical value of any action is determined exclusively by its real-world results, meaning that the ultimate goal of laws, policies, and personal choices must be to generate the highest possible amount of well-being while minimizing total suffering. This perspective has immense practical appeal because it offers a highly pragmatic, problem-solving approach to the messy realities of governing a complex world. It sweeps away ancient superstitions and unprovable dogmas, replacing them with a clear, measurable objective. Look at the final outcome and ensure that more people are helped than harmed. It is a philosophy built for the driver of the runaway vehicle, providing a clear justification for making the painful but necessary choices required to keep the collective human enterprise moving forward through turbulent times. The second mode of thinking stands in direct, unyielding opposition, arguing that morality must be anchored in absolute, unchanging principles that protect the fundamental dignity of the individual, no matter what the consequences look like. This framework insists that certain duties and rights are completely non-negotiable, acting as a permanent shield that the majority can never legally or morally bypass, even if doing so would prevent a massive tragedy. Adherents of this view believe that if we allow the rights of a single innocent person to be bargained away for the greater good, we strip all of human life of its intrinsic value, turning every citizen into a disposable asset for the state. This is the philosophy that keeps us from pushing the bystander off the bridge and prevents the surgeon from entering the room of the sleeping patient. It reminds us that a society built purely on mathematical calculation is not a civilization at all, but a sophisticated meat grinder where individual existence is entirely surrendered to the shifting numbers of the crowd. The intellectual foundation for the outcome-driven approach was systematically constructed during the late 18th century by thinkers who sought to revolutionize legal and political structures by grounding them in human psychology. They observed that all human beings, regardless of their cultural background or social status, are ultimately ruled by two sovereign forces: the desire for pleasure and the absolute avoidance of pain. Because we are biologically wired to seek happiness and avoid misery, it follows that our entire moral and legal framework should be explicitly designed to reflect this fundamental reality. The ultimate standard for virtue, justice, and public policy must therefore be the maximization of utility, which is simply the total balance of happiness over suffering within a community. This philosophy, frequently distilled into the popular phrase, "the greatest good for the greatest number," provides a powerful tool for social reform, as it demands that every law and institution justify its existence by proving it actually increases the collective well-being of the population. When we apply this principle of utility to the grand architecture of society, it becomes a radical force for efficiency, public health, and systematic planning. It compels governments to evaluate infrastructure projects, economic policies, and legal codes through a strictly objective lens, asking how many citizens will benefit versus how many will endure a burden. From this perspective, individual sacrifices are not viewed as acts of cruelty. but as the necessary rational cost of maintaining a functional and prosperous civilization. The construction of a massive public transit system, for instance, might require the forced relocation of a small neighborhood, causing undeniable distress to those families. However, the utility model justifies this disruption because millions of commuters will gain hours of their lives back every single year. The constant drive is toward optimization, ensuring that the collective assets of humanity are managed in a way that yields the highest possible return in human comfort, security, and progress. Yet the persistent danger of relying entirely on this outcome-based model is that it possesses an inherent tendency to turn colder and more clinical the larger the scale of governance becomes. When public administrators and politicians look at the world solely through the lens of maximizing collective utility, individual suffering runs the risk of being reduced to mere data points on an economic spreadsheet. The terrifying historical warnings of totalitarian regimes and systematic oppressions often trace their roots back to a perverted version of this exact logic, where entire populations are targeted for elimination or enslavement under the banner of purifying or strengthening the state for future generations. If the ultimate metric of justice is merely the total sum of collective happiness, then the suffering of a despised minority can easily be mathematically offset by the intense satisfaction or economic prosperity of a massive, unprincipled majority. This vulnerability forces us to question whether a moral system without absolute internal boundaries can ever truly protect human freedom over the long haul. This is precisely why the study of political and moral philosophy carries such an intense, deeply personal risk for anyone who chooses to look beneath the surface of their everyday assumptions. Philosophy operates by taking the familiar, comfortable ideas we have held since childhood and rendering them entirely strange and unsettling, forcing us to confront the intense contradictions in our own behavior. It does not achieve this by handing us a stack of brand new information or teaching us foreign facts. Rather, it invites a completely new way of seeing the things we have already looked at 1,000 times. Once you begin to see the hidden mechanics behind your moral choices, the innocent certainty of your original worldview is permanently fractured and can never be fully restored. It is a process of intellectual maturity that mirrors a loss of innocence, because once you realize that your daily life is built on deep, unresolved conflicts between utility and rights, you can no longer comfortably participate in society without questioning the very foundations of your legal and political systems. This unsettling transformation can have a profoundly distancing, even paralyzing effect on an individual's relationship with their community and their duties as a citizen. By forcing us to question the basic conventions and unstated agreements that keep society running smoothly, philosophy creates a psychological gap between the student and the active, unreflective life of the marketplace. This is why practical, action-oriented people throughout history have frequently warned youth against diving too deeply into these endless abstract arguments, viewing them as a dangerous distraction from the real business of building a career and securing wealth. They argue that spending your prime years debating unsolvable ethical paradoxes is a form of intellectual ruin that makes a person completely unfit for the sharp, competitive realities of commerce and politics. There is an undeniable truth to this warning, as the continuous interrogation of what is truly just can easily erode the blind confidence required to ruthlessly pursue personal success and participate in the uncritical patriotism that nations often demand. Faced with the immense friction of these internal contradictions and the personal risks of continuous self-examination, the human mind frequently searches for an easy exit, which usually takes the form of moral skepticism. This coping mechanism suggests that because the world's greatest minds have spent thousands of years debating these exact same dilemmas without ever reaching a final, universally accepted consensus, the entire pursuit is a waste of time. Skeptics argue that morality is ultimately nothing more than a subjective collection of personal tastes, emotional reactions, and cultural conditioning, meaning there is no objective way to declare one action superior to another. It is an incredibly tempting resting place for the intellect, as it completely absolves a person from the difficult, exhausting work of trying to bring their personal actions into alignment with their stated principles. By declaring the entire field of ethics an unresolvable matter of opinion, the skeptic can comfortably withdraw from the conversation and simply live life according to whatever conveniences or social trends happen to surround them. However, simply surrendering to this casual skepticism is an entirely fraudulent solution to the problem of human existence, because it ignores the undeniable reality that we are forced to live out an answer to these questions every single day. Every time we vote for a policy, pay our taxes, support a war, or make a medical decision for a loved one, we are actively endorsing a specific philosophy of justice, whether we want to admit it or not. Skepticism may serve as a temporary intellectual rest stop where the mind can pause to reflect on its confusion, but it can never serve as a permanent home for a rational human being. The continuous restlessness of our reason demands that we keep pushing forward, trying to untangle the messy web of our ethical judgments, because the stories we are debating are ultimately not abstract fictions, but the literal blueprint of our collective survival. We cannot afford to abandon the argument because the final outcome of this ongoing philosophical debate directly shapes the laws that govern our bodies, our property, and our fundamental freedom. To see this philosophical battle manifest in the real world, we must look away from clean classroom hypotheticals and examine the gritty, unvarnished history of human crisis, where actual lives hang on the line. In the historical annals of maritime law, there are few events that capture the terrifying reality of raw survival more vividly than the real-world case of the yacht Mignonette, which foundered in the open ocean during the late 19th century. Four English sailors were left stranded in a tiny lifeboat, thousands of miles from land, with nothing but 2 cans of turnips and no access to fresh water. As the days bled into weeks, the absolute baseline of human morality was pushed to its absolute breaking point, stripping away the refined legal assumptions of Victorian England and replacing them with the primal mathematics of biological preservation. The scenario ceased to be a playful debate about turning a vehicle and became an agonizing reality where the physical bodies of human beings became the literal currency of survival. The crew consisted of 3 seasoned seamen, Dudley, Stevens, and Brooks, and a young, innocent cabin boy named Richard Parker, who was an orphan making his very first voyage across the sea. After nearly 3 weeks of absolute starvation and dehydration, during which the cabin boy had fallen desperately ill from drinking ocean water, the group found themselves staring into the abyss of imminent death. It was in this state of absolute desperation that the captain, Dudley, suggested that a single individual should be sacrificed, so that the remaining 3 might have a statistical chance of surviving until a rescue vessel appeared. The logic was purely mathematical and deeply rooted in the principle of maximizing survival. The cabin boy was incredibly weak, had no family depending on his income, and was likely to pass away first regardless of what choice was made. By actively terminating his life before his body was entirely wasted by disease, his physical remains could sustain the other 3 men, who all had wives, children, and deep social responsibilities waiting for them back home. When the moment of crisis reached its peak, Dudley and Stevens acted upon this cold calculation, while Brooks chose to remain completely passive, refusing to participate in the act but ultimately consuming the sustenance it provided. For several more days, the 3 surviving men sustained their own failing bodies using the physical remains of the cabin boy, until a passing vessel finally spotted them and returned them to the shores of England. Upon their arrival, the full force of civilized law immediately collided with the brutal realities of ocean survival, as the men were arrested and charged with the crime of willful murder. The subsequent trial became an absolute focal point for global legal philosophy, forcing a comfortable, stable society to decide whether the absolute laws of human rights could ever be legally bypassed by the urgent, mathematical necessities of extreme survival. The defense argued passionately that the men had operated under a state of absolute necessity, where the survival of 3 lives outweighed the tragic loss of one who was already on the verge of death. From a purely outcome-based perspective, the actions taken by the crew on that desolate lifeboat present an incredibly powerful case for the minimization of total human tragedy. If the captain had chosen to do absolutely nothing out of a sacred respect for the cabin boy's right to life, all 4 individuals would have inevitably perished in the open ocean before the rescue ship ever crossed their path. The total sum of human misery in that scenario would have been dramatically higher, leaving 4 families devastated and resulting in a total loss of human potential across the board. By making the agonizing, horrific choice to sacrifice the weakest member, 2 fathers and a senior seaman were successfully restored to their families, ensuring that the total volume of grief was minimized and the number of survivors was maximized. The math appears completely flawless. 4 dead versus 1 dead and 3 saved is an equation that any rational administrator of resources would instantly choose if they were managing an abstract system from a position of safety. Yet the collective conscience of the legal system experienced a profound, unyielding revulsion at this defense, recognizing that if necessity could be used to legitimize the deliberate killing of an innocent person, the entire concept of human justice would crumble. The prosecution insisted that a person's life cannot be treated as a disposable commodity to be balanced against the lives of others, no matter how desperate the circumstances become. If the law were to accept that a person's value is determined by their social utility, their family ties, their economic output, or their physical strength, then the weak, the isolated, and the vulnerable would permanently live under the shadow of predation by the powerful. The court ultimately rejected the plea of necessity, asserting that the duty to preserve one's own life does not include a legal right to actively take the life of an innocent companion to achieve that end. This monumental decision drew a permanent line in the sand, declaring that human civilization must value the absolute purity of its moral boundaries over the cold, mathematical optimization of survival outcomes. Part 2. The profound legal and philosophical fallout from the trial of the stranded sailors forces us to systematically interrogate the core mechanism of the outcome-driven model of justice, exposing its most critical structural flaws. When we examine the philosophy that demands we maximize collective happiness, we quickly realize that it hinges entirely on our ability to accurately measure and compare human experiences. To say that one action is morally superior to another, because it yields a higher net sum of pleasure, requires us to treat all forms of human satisfaction as if they belong to a single, uniform currency. This assumption implies that the joy of a parent watching their child succeed, the comfort of a warm meal, the thrill of artistic creation, and the malicious pleasure of a crowd mocking a nonconformist can all be weighed on the exact same scale. It treats the human psyche as a flat ledger where diverse, deeply complex emotions are reduced to simple positive and negative integers, completely ignoring the immense qualitative differences that define our inner lives. This rigid reductionism becomes deeply alarming when we look at how a purely mathematical approach to happiness completely fails to respect the boundaries that separate individual human beings from one another. By focusing exclusively on the total sum of collective utility within a population, this model treats the entire community as if it were a single giant organism, completely indifferent to how that utility is actually distributed among real people. If a policy brings an immense amount of economic wealth and security to 80% of the citizenry, the model is perfectly willing to overlook the absolute misery, exploitation, and degradation of the remaining 20%. The fundamental flaw is that it lacks a concept of individual sanctity. It does not care who suffers or who rejoices, so long as the final number at the bottom of the ledger is as high as possible. This indifference means that the most basic human rights of a person, their freedom, their safety, their bodily integrity, can be completely bartered away the moment the collective desires of the majority become large enough to outweigh them. To understand how easily this mathematical framework can be weaponized against human dignity, we only need to look at how major corporations and public utilities utilize cost-benefit analyses to make decisions that directly impact human survival. In a famous corporate legal dispute from the late 20th century, a major automotive manufacturer discovered a significant design flaw in the fuel tank of a popular vehicle model, which made it highly susceptible to exploding during rear-end collisions. Instead of immediately halting production or issuing a massive recall to fix the defect, the company's management commissioned a highly detailed clinical economic study to evaluate the financial consequences of both paths. They calculated the exact monetary value of a human life based on historical insurance payouts, estimated the cost of burn injuries, and multiplied those figures by the predicted number of accidents that would occur if the defect remained unaddressed. They then compared that total liability figure against the per-vehicle cost of installing a simple safety component across millions of assembly line units. The final results of the corporate spreadsheet revealed that it was significantly cheaper to allow a predictable number of customers to burn to death in accidents than it was to spend the money required to fix the mechanical flaw across the entire fleet. Armed with this cold calculation, the company chose to proceed with production, actively choosing to absorb the legal payouts for human casualties as a standard cost of doing business rather than reducing their profit margins. When this internal document was eventually leaked to the public during a subsequent lawsuit, it triggered a wave of global outrage that exposed the deep moral bankruptcy of treating human survival as a fluid line item in a corporate budget. This corporate scandal perfectly illustrates the terrifying logical conclusion of a pure utility model. When you force human life into a quantitative equation, you inevitably strip it of its sacred character, turning the ultimate value of existence into a crude negotiation over profit margins and legal liabilities. The deep public revulsion toward these corporate calculations reveals a profound truth that the mathematical model of justice completely fails to grasp. Human beings do not believe that all forms of value can be translated into a single monetary or quantitative scale. There is an irreplaceable, qualitative difference between the value of an abstract commodity like a car parts factory and the value of a human being's physical life, and attempting to equate the two is an act of deep psychological violence. We look at the corporate spreadsheet and feel an intense sense of violation not because the math is incorrect, but because the very act of putting a price tag on a person's life feels like a fundamental betrayal of our collective humanity. It forces us to realize that true justice must involve certain values that are entirely beyond praise, meaning they can never be balanced against economic efficiency, public convenience, or collective wealth. If a society loses the capacity to recognize these sacred, unquantifiable boundaries, it ceases to be a community of citizens and becomes a cold network of resources to be managed. This systemic failure to recognize qualitative differences becomes even more obvious when we examine how the utility model treats different levels of intellectual and sensory pleasure, as if they are completely identical in value. The early architects of the outcome-driven theory proudly asserted that the source of a person's happiness is entirely irrelevant to the moral equation, meaning that if a simple game brings more intense pleasure to a person than reading profound poetry, then that game is a superior source of utility. They famously argued that quantity of pleasure being equal, pushpin is as good as poetry, a claim that completely flattens the cultural and intellectual achievements of human civilization. This perspective intentionally strips away all notions of refinement, artistic excellence, and intellectual depth, replacing them with a purely democratic sensory metric that values whatever historical trend or cheap distraction happens to trigger the highest immediate dopamine response in the largest number of brains. This radical egalitarianism might sound appealingly open-minded at first glance, but it quickly leads to a deeply degraded view of human potential that most people find impossible to accept in practice. If the ultimate goal of human life is simply to accumulate the highest possible volume of pure, uncritical pleasure, then a person who spends their entire existence in a state of passive, medicated comfort would be living a superior life to a brilliant artist or scientist who endures immense struggle and anxiety to create enduring works of genius. It suggests that society should focus its resources on providing cheap, mass-manufactured entertainment and sensory stimulation rather than funding complex education, deep artistic exploration, and challenging intellectual pursuits. This realization forced later generations of outcome-oriented philosophers to desperately try to reform the theory, attempting to argue that certain pleasures, specifically intellectual, artistic, and moral ones, are qualitatively superior to raw physical sensations, regardless of their sheer intensity. However, the moment you admit that some pleasures are inherently higher and more valuable than others due to their qualitative nature, you have completely broken the core mechanism of the original mathematical theory. You are no longer using the total volume of raw pleasure as your ultimate standard for justice. Instead, you are introducing an external independent moral standard, a separate ideal of human dignity and intellectual excellence, to judge which pleasures are worthy of pursuit. If we prefer a tragic, thought-provoking drama over a simplistic, comforting piece of reality television, it is frequently not because the drama gives us a higher quantity of raw pleasure, but because it engages our higher human faculties and speaks to our deeper understanding of the human condition. This preference proves that our sense of value is deeply tied to a concept of personal growth and structural excellence that cannot be measured on a flat scale of sensory satisfaction, completely undermining the claim that utility is the sole master of human behavior. To see how these competing ideas about higher pleasures and individual rights play out on a massive political scale, we must look at the structural design of modern democratic societies, which constantly struggle to balance majority rule with constitutional protections. The primary mechanism of democratic governance is inherently outcome-oriented, as it relies on the voting power of the majority to determine the laws, taxes, and leadership of the entire nation. In a perfectly majoritarian system without any internal speed bumps, the collective will of 51% of the population would possess the absolute authority to pass any law they desired, regardless of how much damage it inflicted on the remaining 49%. If a massive majority of citizens shared a deep, irrational hatred for a specific religious or ethnic minority, a pure majoritarian calculation would declare that passing discriminatory laws against that minority is perfectly just because it maximizes the satisfaction of the vast majority of the population. This terrifying vulnerability is precisely why stable, enduring democracies do not operate on a purely majoritarian model, but instead explicitly bind themselves with constitutional bills of rights that are completely insulated from the shifting whims of the crowd. These foundational documents operate on a strictly categorical logic, declaring that certain fundamental freedoms, such as freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, and the right to due process, are completely non-negotiable. They serve as an absolute legal wall that a majority can never cross, even if a massive percentage of the population desperately wants to silence a dissenting voice or seize the property of a nonconformist group. This structural choice is a profound, institutional confession that numbers alone can never be trusted with the administration of human justice, and that a civilization must place the essential rights of the individual entirely outside the reach of the mathematical calculations of public utility. This continuous tension between the pragmatic desires of the majority and the sacred rights of the individual is the literal engine that drives the evolution of our legal and political history. When we look back at the grand trajectory of human progress, the most significant breakthroughs in justice have not been achieved by meticulously calculating spreadsheets of public happiness, but by individuals standing up and demanding that their fundamental dignity be recognized, consequences be what they may. The global movement for the abolition of human slavery, the fight for women's suffrage, and the ongoing struggle for civil rights were all explicitly launched as a direct moral challenge to systems that were generating immense economic utility for the majorities that controlled them. If early reformers had allowed their causes to be evaluated purely through a cost-benefit lens, defenders of the status quo could have easily argued that disrupting those deeply entrenched economic systems would cause a massive, short-term drop in collective societal wealth and stability. By completely rejecting that economic framework and insisting that human beings can never be legally treated as property or second-class citizens, these movements forced humanity to expand its moral horizon beyond the flat calculation of outcomes. They demonstrated that true justice requires a deep, unwavering commitment to certain universal truths about human worth that no amount of public convenience or economic prosperity can ever legally override. This realization brings us right back to the central dilemma of the runaway vehicle and the medical clinic. It reminds us that while maximizing survival and well-being is an incredibly important duty of governance, it must always operate within a strict cage of absolute moral boundaries. The true measure of a society's moral maturity is not how efficiently it optimizes its resources in times of comfort, but how fiercely it protects the rights of its most vulnerable citizens when panic and crisis threaten to turn the world upside down. To fully appreciate the historical architecture of this debate, we must recognize how these two competing philosophies have deeply shaped the legal structures, economic systems, and public institutions we interact with every single day. The outcome-driven model has provided the intellectual blueprint for our massive public health initiatives, our environmental protection agencies, and our global economic policies, all of which rely heavily on statistical data to minimize harm across massive populations. When a regulatory body establishes safety thresholds for air pollution or food manufacturing, it is operating on a purely utilitarian baseline, consciously accepting that a tiny, statistically predictable number of individuals will get sick so that the entire nation can enjoy an abundant, affordable supply of energy and food. The model is deeply woven into the very fabric of our collective infrastructure, acting as the quiet, pragmatic operating system that allows millions of diverse individuals to live together without the machinery of civilization grinding to a halt. At the exact same time, our legal systems, our criminal courts, and our concepts of personal liberty are entirely anchored in the opposing, categorical framework that views individual rights as a permanent, sacred shield. When our courts operate on the principle that it is infinitely better for 10 guilty individuals to go completely free than for a single innocent person to be wrongfully imprisoned, we are making an explicit, non-utilitarian choice to prioritize absolute moral purity over raw societal safety. A pure utility calculation would easily argue that locking up a few innocent people is a small, acceptable price to pay if it means clearing the streets of crime and making millions of citizens feel completely secure in their homes. By rejecting that colder logic, our legal system proudly declares that an individual's right to freedom is so immense that society must willingly absorb the real-world costs and dangers of letting criminals slip away rather than violating its own internal boundaries of justice. This permanent duality means that as citizens, we are required to continuously navigate a complex, shifting landscape where both numbers and principles demand our allegiance, often at the exact same moment. The true difficulty of modern political life consists in the fact that we do not live in a clean, single-theory world. Instead, we are forced to constantly negotiate the border between what is useful for the crowd and what is fair to the individual. When a new public crisis emerges, whether it takes the form of a global pandemic, an economic collapse, or a national security threat, this latent philosophical civil war instantly flares up in our public squares and legislative halls. We find ourselves immediately arguing about whether the state has the legal right to restrict individual movements, mandate behaviors, or seize resources for the collective survival of the nation, or whether those actions represent an unacceptable violation of personal autonomy that must be resisted at all costs. It is precisely during these moments of immense collective stress that the temptation to slide into a pure numbers game becomes almost impossible to resist, as panic makes the absolute protection of individual rights feel like an unaffordable luxury. When people feel their safety threatened, they are highly prone to demanding that the government do whatever it takes to eliminate the danger, eagerly offering up the freedoms of unpopular minorities or nonconformist groups on the altar of public security. This is the exact moment when the categorical framework becomes most vital to our survival as a free people, acting as an intellectual anchor that keeps us from drifting into the absolute tyranny of a panicked majority. It reminds us that if we allow our core values to be treated as fluid variables that can be modified whenever a crisis arrives, we have effectively admitted that we do not actually possess any real values at all, only preferences that we hold until things get difficult. The continuous study of these ethical dilemmas is therefore not an eccentric academic exercise reserved for elite classrooms, but a critical act of civic preservation that keeps our democratic institutions grounded in human dignity. By forcing ourselves to repeatedly confront the intense friction between utility and rights, we train our minds to resist the simplistic, black-and-white slogans that dominate our public political discourse. We begin to see that every complex public policy contains a deep, unstated philosophical trade-off, and that making a truly just choice requires us to look far beyond the immediate economic benefits or emotional appeals of a proposal. It compels us to ask the uncomfortable, essential questions: who is bearing the hidden burden of this collective choice? Which fundamental rights are being compromised so that the majority can live in comfort? Is this policy treating human beings as valuable ends in themselves, or merely as raw material to be consumed by the machinery of progress? Ultimately, we must accept that the deep internal tension between maximizing collective happiness and protecting individual sanctity is a permanent feature of the human condition that will never be neatly resolved by any single philosophical system. We are deeply social creatures who must continuously cooperate to build a stable, prosperous world, yet we are also distinct individuals who possess an inner life and a personal dignity that belongs completely to us alone. The true goal of our ongoing moral reflection is not to find a magic formula that wipes away this tension, but to develop the intellectual honesty and the emotional maturity required to live within it responsibly. We must remain pragmatic enough to care deeply about the real-world consequences of our actions, while remaining principled enough to recognize that there are certain lines we must never cross, even if the whole world is begging us to turn the wheel. As we look toward the future challenges of our rapidly evolving world, from the governance of advanced artificial intelligence to the management of global environmental shifts, the stakes of this ongoing philosophical debate will only continue to rise. The systems we are building possess a computational capacity to optimize human behavior on a scale that ancient philosophers could never have imagined, raising the terrifying prospect of a world completely ruled by cold, algorithmic calculations of efficiency and utility. If we surrender our public architecture entirely to these metrics, we run the risk of creating a highly functional, perfectly optimized society that has completely lost its human soul. To prevent this dark future, we must fiercely maintain our commitment to the restless, challenging work of self-examination, ensuring that our concepts of justice always remain anchored in a deep respect for the individual lives that make up the human story. The journey through these difficult ethical landscapes remains intensely riveting precisely because the arguments we are having are never truly about distant, abstract entities. They are a direct, unvarnished mirror held up to our own daily choices and political realities. We cannot comfortably retreat into the safety of casual skepticism or unthinking convention, because the laws we choose to support are actively shaping the literal definition of what it means to be a human being within a civilized community. We are the drivers of the vehicle, the onlookers on the bridge, the physicians in the clinic, and the sailors on the desolate ocean, and every single choice we make leaves a permanent mark on the moral architecture of our world. By continuing to participate in this great conversation, we keep the true spirit of justice alive, ensuring that our reason remains continuously restless, completely awake, and permanently searching for the light.